You hear a lot about boomers. You hear even more about millennials. Gen Z gets analysed in real time, like a live experiment. But there's a generation in between that rarely gets discussed at all. And when it is, it's usually reduced to sarcasm, apathy, or flannel. Generation X, born roughly between the mid-1960s and early 1980s. They're often described as detached, cynical, emotionally unavailable, but psychologically, that interpretation misses what actually happened. Because Gen X wasn't disengaged, they were conditioned. Gen X grew up during a quiet erosion of trust, not one dramatic collapse, but a slow realization that the systems around them didn't always mean what they said. They watched authority figures contradict themselves. They watched institutions promise stability and then fail without explanation. Many of them came home to empty houses, not because their parents didn't care, but because survival increasingly required two incomes. This wasn't framed as neglect. It was framed as normal. You let yourself in. You figured it out. You didn't call anyone unless something was seriously wrong. And that shaped something deep. Psychologically, Gen X learned early that independence wasn't optional. No one was hovering. No one was checking in. No one was managing their emotions for them. So their nervous systems adapted. They learned to assess situations quickly, to anticipate consequences, to regulate themselves internally. This is what psychologists would call a strong internal locus of control. But it didn't come with reassurance. It came with responsibility. This is why Gen X tends to think ahead in ways that confuse younger generations. They're not pessimistic. They're predictive. They learned that actions have consequences, and those consequences often arrive fast and without negotiation. There wasn't much room for processing feelings before the outcome showed up, so they learned to read rooms, calculate risk, and adjust behaviour early. Not because they were anxious, but because that's how you stayed intact. They also grew up watching loyalty fail. They watched parents commit decades to companies only to be laid off without ceremony. They watched marriages dissolve, promises change, rules quietly rewrite themselves. So Gen X absorbed a subtle lesson: don't anchor your identity to things you don't control. This is why they trust skills more than titles, competence more than optimism, experience more than enthusiasm. They don't need to believe in the system. They need to function within it. Their emotional style often gets misread. Gen X isn't emotionally cold. They're emotionally contained. They grew up in a culture where emotional expression was rarely rewarded and sometimes actively punished. So they learned regulation before expression. Humour became a pressure valve. Irony became armour. Detachment became protection. Not because they didn't feel deeply, but because feeling publicly didn't change outcomes. So why risk it? Gen X cares. They just don't perform caring. They don't narrate effort. They don't broadcast vulnerability. They don't need constant validation loops. Their care shows up quietly. They fix things. They solve problems. They show up when it matters. Technology arrived later for Gen X, and the timing matters more than people realise. They learned how to think, plan, remember, and problem solve before external memory existed. If you wanted information, you worked for it. Libraries, manuals, trial and error. If something broke, you didn't Google it. You opened it up. That effort created confidence. Not confidence in knowing everything, but confidence in figuring things out. Which is why Gen X often adapts to new systems without announcing that adaptation. Their skepticism toward visibility also makes sense. They grew up when mistakes faded, when embarrassment wasn't archived, when identity wasn't searchable. So broadcasting your life doesn't feel empowering. It feels risky. In their psychological framework, privacy equals control. The less exposed you are, the harder you are to destabilize. At work, this shows up as reliability without branding. They don't self-market constantly. They don't need to be seen hustling. They don't confuse motion with meaning. They do the job. They get better at it. They move on. And when systems fail, as they quietly expect them to, they already have a backup plan. Gen X was also shaped by repeated economic disruption, not one crash, multiple. Each one reinforcing the same message: nothing is permanent. This created adaptability, but also a baseline assumption that stability is temporary. Which is why many Gen Xers diversify income, avoid over-identifying with jobs, and stay psychologically prepared for loss. Not out of fear. There's a paradox at the core of Gen X psychology. They are deeply independent, yet quietly dependable. They won't ask for help easily, but if you need help, they'll show up without fanfare. They don't post about it. They don't need credit. They just handle it. Now they're watching younger generations grow up in a very different world, one with constant supervision, constant documentation, constant feedback. They gave their kids the attention they never had, but sometimes worry they removed the space where resilience forms. Because in the Gen X worldview, being visible also means being vulnerable. Generation X isn't invisible because they lack impact. They're invisible because they don't demand attention. They're the connective tissue between analog and digital, between trust and skepticism, between optimism and realism. They learned how to function in systems they didn't fully believe in without losing themselves in the process. And that may be one of the most psychologically complex adaptations any generation has had to make. They don't need to be understood. They just need things to work. And if this resonated with you, you probably don't need an explanation why. You already saw it coming. This is Humans Behave. Subscribe if you want to understand what's really going on beneath the surface.